Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we are going to be tackling a text that has sparked a lot of debate, a lot of interpretations over the centuries, Genesis chapter 3. We're going beyond just the surface level, beyond Adam and Eve and that fruit, talking hidden meanings, symbolism, and the kind of insights that make you see this ancient text in a whole new light. We're drawing our insights from excerpts of MCS Genesis chapter 3 from My Christian Space, so get ready to unlock some fascinating interpretations.
It really is amazing how much depth and nuance, we can find in these ancient stories in it.
Right. Like take, for instance, that very first verse,
Yeah.
where the serpent is described as crafty, or aruman in Hebrew. What I think is really interesting is that that same word, pluralized as aruman, describes Adam and Eve at the end of chapter 2. They're aruman, or naked. It feels like the text is subtly connecting the serpent's cunning to Adam and Eve's vulnerable state. What do you make of that?
Well, it's a brilliant literary device, isn't it? Because it highlights the contrast between the serpent's corrupted intelligence and the goodness that God saw in all of creation. Just a chapter earlier, remember in Genesis 1, God repeatedly declares that everything that he made was good. But here, with the serpent's introduction, we see this twisting of that goodness, a perversion of intellect.
And it's not just any cunning, right? I mean, there were some interesting parallels to Luke 10:18, where Jesus actually speaks of Satan's fall from heaven. It suggests that the serpent in Genesis isn't just, a talking animal, but potentially a vessel for a malevolent spiritual force that's already been at odds with God.
Absolutely. And, this encounter in the garden really sets the stage for understanding the nature of spiritual warfare. That plays out throughout the rest of the Bible. It's this reminder that the battle isn't just a physical one. It's a battle for hearts and minds, a struggle against deception that we're still dealing with even today.
And speaking of deception, let's talk about Eve's conversation with the serpent for a second. Because she mentions that God commanded them not to even touch the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, a detail not explicitly stated in God's original instructions to Adam. It raises this really crucial point about relying on secondhand information, even in spiritual matters. Eve wasn't actually present when God gave Adam the command, highlighting just how important it is to engage directly with God's word.
Oh, it's like that game of telephone, where the message can get distorted as it's passed along.
Yeah.
And that's one reason why our source emphasizes using a translation that's as close to the original Hebrew as possible, because it really minimizes the risk of, these little misinterpretations that can actually have really big consequences.
So back to the serpent's tactics, he doesn't just outright encourage disobedience. He utilizes these half-truths, these subtle distortions. He tells Eve, your eyes will be opened, suggesting God is withholding something good from them, that they'll become like God by knowing both good and evil. It's a tactic that is, as old as time. It preys on our very human desires for knowledge, power. And, the allure of the forbidden, he focuses on what they lack instead of, all of those blessings that they've already been given.
And that's something that we can all relate to today, right? It's like those, glossy ads that you see
Yeah.
that make a product seem irresistible, but they conveniently omit all the downsides. But getting back to the text, I think it's important to remember that God wasn't setting Adam and Eve up for failure here. He was trying to protect them from the burden of knowing evil.
It really makes you wonder what life would be like if they had trusted in God's goodness instead of, succumbing to that doubt.
Absolutely. And that kind of brings us to Eve's desire for wisdom, which the text calls chokmah in Hebrew. Can you break down that concept for us a little bit? It's more than just knowledge, right? Yeah, you're right. Chokmah is so much richer than just knowledge. It's about possessing the ability to judge rightly, discern truth from falsehood, and live in harmony with God's will. In a Jewish context, chokmah is often personified as a divine attribute, even depicted as a woman in Proverbs.
So when Eve reaches for the fruit, is it possible that she's not just seeking knowledge, but that deeper, divine wisdom represented by chokmah? And if so, is the problem that she's trying to obtain it independently from God?
That's a fascinating interpretation. And it really highlights that danger of seeking wisdom on our own terms. As we'll see, true wisdom comes from a relationship with God, not from grasping for it independently.
It really makes you think, this one word chokmah adds so much to our understanding of Eve's motivation. She wasn't just, going after forbidden knowledge. She was really longing for a deeper understanding of the world and her place in it. But like we're seeing, the path to true wisdom doesn't come from defying God, but from drawing closer to him. And speaking of responsibility, I think it's really interesting how Adam is right there with Eve. During this whole exchange, he's heard God's commands directly. But he remains silent. Why didn't he intervene?
It's such a good question.
Mm.
And it really challenges us to consider, our role in the choices of others. Because Adam,
Yeah.
having received God's instructions firsthand, he had a responsibility to speak up, to remind Eve of the consequences, to stand as a guardian of God's truth. But his silence, however unintentional it might have been, makes him complicit in their disobedience.
Uh-huh.
It highlights this shared responsibility.
Yeah.
That I think we all bear for the consequences of sin.
It's this poignant reminder that sometimes our silence can speak louder than words. And in this case, Adam's inaction has huge consequences. They both eat the fruit, and suddenly, the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked. But this nakedness, it always seemed like it was about more than just physical vulnerability to me. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. I think you're right. It's like their eyes are being opened to the reality of their disobedience, their separation from God, their vulnerability to, temptation and evil. It's the loss of innocence. It's this realization of human frailty. And it's interesting, too, how their immediate response is to hide. First with fig leaves, which is interesting because that's kind of a recurring symbol of safety and security throughout the Bible, and then from God himself.
Right. It's like they instinctively understand that their actions have created this distance between them and their creator. And speaking of God, his response is heartbreaking, but it's hopeful at the same time. He knows where they are, yet he asks this incredibly profound question. Where are you? And it's not a question of location. It's a question of the heart.
Exactly. God's not asking for his own benefit, but for theirs. He's inviting Adam and Eve to confront their actions, to acknowledge the separation that they've created. It's almost like he's saying, Adam, Eve, where have your choices led you? Where are you in relationship to me?
And it's so heartbreaking because instead of just admitting their wrongdoing, Adam immediately shifts the blame. He says, the woman you put here with me, she gave me some fruit from the tree and I ate it. It's like the classic blame game,
Right.
A pattern that we see repeated over and over again throughout history.
It's a tale as old as time.
Totally.
And then Eve does the same thing. She blames the serpent. It's like this natural human response,
Yeah,
to avoid taking responsibility for our mistakes.
for sure.
But as we'll see, God doesn't let them off the hook.
Yeah.
He confronts their sin directly. But even in the midst of judgment, he extends grace and mercy.
And that's where we'll pick up in part 3 of our deep dive into Genesis chapter 3. So we left off with this image of Adam and Eve being banished from the garden, banished from Eden.
It's such a powerful image.
It really is. It feels so final. Like, that's it. End of their idyllic existence in the garden. But you said earlier that God's actions, they're motivated by love here, not just punishment.
Yeah, and that's where I think the tree of life becomes really important. Because remember, it represents true life, a life in perfect communion with God, totally free from sin and death. So when God bars access to the tree of life after the fall, he's actually preventing something far worse for Adam and Eve.
You mean like living forever, but separated from God?
Exactly. Can you imagine
Oh, wow.
immortality without that reconciliation? It would be unimaginable.
It would be an incredible burden.
It's like the difference between just existing and truly living.
So God expelling them from the garden. It's almost like he's protecting them from themselves.
You could see it that way because this act of expulsion, while it represents their separation from God, it also signifies the beginning of a much larger story.
The story of redemption.
Yes. And we actually see hints of this plan throughout the Old Testament, these promises of a coming Messiah, a Redeemer who will bridge the gap created by sin.
And that promise is fulfilled in Jesus, right? In the New Testament.
Absolutely. You could say that Jesus becomes the new tree of life because through his death and resurrection, he atones for the sins of all humanity. He breaks the power of sin and death. That had held us captive since the fall.
So it's through Jesus that we have the opportunity to experience that true life again, that restored relationship with God, that Adam and Eve lost.
Exactly. Jesus reopens the way to the Father, and through him we can experience true forgiveness, renewal, and the promise of eternal life.
It's just incredible to me how this one story, this ancient account of creation and fall, contains such profound truths about who we are as humans and about God's love for us.
It's a story that we see play out again and again throughout history.
It's timeless.
It speaks to those deep longings that we all have for meaning, purpose, connection with God.
It's this reminder that even in those moments, when we make mistakes, when we face the consequences of our choices, God is always there.
He's always there.
Offering us a way back.
Way back to him.
The choice is ours, though.
It really is.
Well, our journey through Genesis chapter 3 may be coming to an end, but the conversations it sparks
Oh, absolutely.
and the questions that it raises, And the truths that it reveals, they stay with us. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
This was great.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep seeking that deeper understanding.
And keep diving deep.